Have you ever thought that maybe winning a war is actually a strange way of losing? Well, today we're going to dive into this really powerful pattern that just keeps popping up throughout history. It's this tendency for the winners to slowly and kind of unconsciously start to look a whole lot like the very enemies they just beat.
So, our story kicks off with a pretty chilling discovery back in 2011. During the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, Navy SEALs were checking out his bookshelf, and they found something that was, well, completely unexpected. They found books written by the very CIA officer who had spent years hunting him down.
I mean, think about that for a second. This discovery, it just reveals this eerie symmetry, right? It's like a two-way mirror between two of the world's most sworn enemies.
Okay, so on one side, you've got Michael Scheuer. He was the head of the CIA's bin Laden unit, and his whole job was to get inside his target's head. And then on the other side, you have bin Laden himself, who was, it turns out, just as obsessed with understanding the mind of his hunter. They were locked in this really bizarre mutual obsession.
But you know what? The story gets even stranger. After Scheuer left the CIA, he started to change. His public comments began to take on this really apocalyptic tone. He was warning about corrupt elites and calling for armed resistance, language that sounded alarmingly similar to the extremists he'd spent his whole career fighting.
So this all leads to a really big question about conflict itself. I mean, how does that even happen? How does staring into the abyss of your enemy for so long start to actually change who you are?
Well, the answer is in this powerful idea that explains this pattern that we see again and again in history. And believe me, it goes way beyond just one CIA agent.
It's a phenomenon called the Victor-Vanquished Synthesis. Now, I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's the process where winning a fight leads you to unconsciously adopt the methods, the ideas, and even the worldview of the very enemy you just defeated.
And this isn't some newfangled idea. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned us about this exact thing over 100 years ago. He said, when you fight monsters, you better be careful not to become one yourself. And that famous line of his, if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. Yeah, this is what he was talking about.
Okay, so how does this actually work? What are the nuts and bolts of how Victor starts absorbing the vanquished? Well, the source material breaks it down into 5 key drivers that make this transformation happen.
Let's run through them real quick. First up, you've got practical necessity. This one's easy. If the enemy has a tool or a system that just works, the winner's going to start using it. Next is incomplete victory. You might win the war, but the enemy's ideas and culture, they stick around. Third is proximity. Just spending a long time fighting or occupying a place naturally leads to imitation. Number 4 is an ideological vacuum. So if the winner destroys an old system but doesn't have a strong culture to replace it with, well, something's got to fill that void. And finally, and this one is kind of creepy, is mythic transference. This is where, over time, we start to romanticize the defeated enemy, and their dangerous ideas get a little cleaned up.
And what's really fascinating is that once you know this pattern, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere in history. This is not a new thing, not by a long shot.
Just take ancient Rome. They conquered Greece with brute military force, no question. But just a few generations later, the Roman elite were completely obsessed with Greek culture. They were speaking Greek, their kids were being educated in Athens, and even the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, wrote his famous meditations in Greek. So Rome won the war, but you could say Greek culture won the peace.
Or how about the Mongols? We're talking about maybe the most dominant military force in human history. They steamrolled all of China, building the largest land empire the world has ever seen. But then, what happened? Within a few generations, the Mongol rulers were completely absorbed. They adopted the Chinese language, their government, their customs. They pretty much became Chinese.
And this pattern, it just repeats over and over. The Bolsheviks in Russia, they overthrow the Tsar, only to create their own version of a brutal autocracy, complete with secret police and prison camps. Or the European Crusaders. They went off to conquer the Islamic world, but they came back with the science and philosophy that actually helped spark their own renaissance.
So, it is so important to understand that this isn't just dusty old history. This isn't something for the textbooks. This is a living, breathing dynamic that is shaping our world right now.
When you get right down to it, victory is never the final word. Every conflict is a two-way street. The losers, they always leave behind these little ghosts of themselves, ideas, ways of doing things, behaviors, and the winner just inevitably picks them up. The very act of fighting something, it changes you.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to think about. In any conflict, whenever one side wins on the battlefield,
we should always stop and ask ourselves, what has the other side, the vanquished, already managed to win inside the minds and the systems of the victor?